This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into episode 53 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. For today's episode, we will be doing a full recap with key observations and trends from around the league in Week 16. But before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show. We are on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. Now verified, we are at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Let's start with the Thursday night game and the Los Angeles Rams, because Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua were each above a 34% target share on Thursday night. They had a combined 72% target share between the two of them. It's only the second time this year where both Kupp and Nacua had 10-plus targets each in a single game. Now, coming into Week 16, the Rams had the highest target share to the wide receiver unit in the NFL at 71%. But in Week 16, Kupp, Nacua, and Demarcus Robinson combined for 91% of Matthew Stafford's targets. Now, specifically Puka Nacua, he had his best fantasy game of the year. In Week 16, he had 33 PPR points. He had 11 targets, his most since Week 7. And he finished as wide receiver 3 on the week, which is the 8th time this season that Nacua has finished inside the weekly top 12 in PPR scoring. Now, once the regular season ends, I'll have a handful of episodes doing a full season recap. But Puka Nacua is absolutely going to be in the mix for the most valuable asset in fantasy football this season. As for the New Orleans Saints, Chris Olave had 13 targets in Week 16. That was his most since Week 7. His 33% target share was the highest on the season. And while Olave has not had that monster week-winning game this year for you, he has been consistent and reliable every week in your lineup. He has 10 games this season where he has finished between wide receiver 9 and wide receiver 27 in weekly scoring. Now, Taysom Hill, he has barely played since missing Week 14 due to an injury. If you look at his average snap participation per game, weeks 4 through 7, he played 52% of snaps. Weeks 8 to 13, it was down to 39%. He missed Week 14 due to the injury, and then in weeks 15 and 16, he's only played 18% of snaps. And then lastly, Alvin Kamara, he played his highest snap participation, 73%, and he ran his most routes, 21, since the Saints' Week 11 bye week. However, he had his lowest number of total opportunities. He only had 9 carries plus 6 targets for only 8.5 PPR points, which is his lowest in a 5-game sample post-bye week. Now, Alvin Kamara's target per route run rate coming into Week 16 was an incredibly high 35%. In Week 16, that was down to 28.5%, which is still solid for a running back, but is down compared to the elite 40% rate that he was hitting in the prior 3 weeks. Bengals wide receiver T. Higgins hit over 80% snap rate with at least 8 targets in Week 16. He had 25 PPR points, which was good for wide receiver 10 on the week. Now that is only the 6th time this season that T. Higgins has achieved a minimum 80% snap rate and a minimum 8 targets. Now, dating back to last year, when T. Higgins hits those marks, again, 80% snap rate and 8 targets, he averages 18.5 PPR points per game. And if you exclude the Week 1 game this year where he had 0 points on 8 targets, then Higgins averages almost 20 PPR points per game. And without Jamar Chase, Bengals 6th-round rookie Andrea Iosivas, he saw a season-high 72% snap rate. He ran 34 routes, which is 3rd on the team behind Higgins and Boyd. He had 8 targets, which is good for a 20% target share. Now, there is a lot of uncertainty going into 2024 with this wide receiver unit, specifically around T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. I would expect at least one and potentially both to be gone off the Bengals roster next year, leaving Andrea Iosivas and also another rookie, Charlie Jones, as potential dynasty stashes going into next season. As for the Pittsburgh Steelers, Jaylen Warren outsnapped Najee Harris for the second straight week, 34 snaps to 26 in Week 16. However, Najee Harris had a 58% to 42% lead in opportunity share, as Harris had 19 opportunities compared to only 14 for Jaylen Warren. This is higher than the 55-45 opportunity share split that Harris had coming in to Week 16. Now, teammate George Pickens, he had his highest fantasy game, not just of the year, but of his career, 34.5 PPR points, and he did it on his second lowest snap rate of the season, 78%. Now, I will warn you, this is a bit of fool's gold, because since Week 10, Pickens has consistently ranged between 3 to 5 receptions per game, and his average PPR points from Week 10 through 15 on those 3 to 5 receptions, 8.5 points per game. In Week 16, on 4 receptions, he had 34.5 points. And per Jeff Bell on Twitter, George Pickens has played 832 snaps this season. Yet 31% of his fantasy production has come on 4 plays, which is less than 1% of his total snaps. Again, let me repeat that. Less than 1% of his snaps has accounted for almost 33% of his total fantasy production. And quarterback Mason Rudolph, he made his season debut in Week 16. He looked solid, looked very competent as a professional quarterback. He had 2 touchdowns. He had 20 fantasy football points in that game. And by comparison, the number of multi-touchdown games that Kenny Pickett has had this season, 1. And the number of 20-point fantasy games that Kenny Pickett has had this year, 0. From weeks 1 through 14, the Buffalo Bills were averaging 33 team targets per game. However, the last 2 weeks, weeks 15 and 16, that number is down to 17 team targets per game. That is a decrease of 16 fewer targets across the team the last 2 weeks. Now, everyone, with the exception of James Cook, is suffering from a fantasy standpoint because of this, but most notably is Stefon Diggs. If you look at his average targets per game, weeks 1 through 8, his average targets per game, 11.2. Weeks 9 through 14, down to 8.4. And the last 2 weeks, weeks 15 and 16, down to 6.5. And even worse, his combined catch rate split between weeks 1 through 8 was 71%, and weeks 9 through 16 was 58%. So you see the total pie decreasing. You see his targets count decreasing, and his success rate, or his catch rate, decreasing. All this adding up to a pretty pedestrian fantasy performance here in the last month for Stefon Diggs. Looking at the Atlanta Falcons' backfield opportunity share from weeks 10 through 15, Bijan Robinson only had a 54% opportunity share. Tyler Algier was at 29%, Cordell Patterson was at 17%. Now in week 16, this looked very similar. Again, Bijan Robinson was exactly at 54% opportunity share. Algier was at 24, Patterson was at 22. But Bijan still scored 19.2 PPR points. He finished as wide receiver 10 on the week. So how did Bijan Robinson improve his fantasy scoring in Week 16 with similar opportunity share? Well, there's 2 points here. He had a season-high 10 targets. He caught 7 for 50 yards. That's 12 PPR points right there. And on top of that, he had another 72 rushing yards on just 12 carries. So his 6 yards per carry was the highest since Week 4. Now, his fantasy points per snap remain very strong, but he has lacked the workhorse role needed to be an elite fantasy running back. Without Michael Pittman in the lineup, rookie Josh Downs, he had his highest snap rate of the season. He was at 93%, and he had his highest target volume in a month with 9 targets. Now, you'll have to monitor the health of Michael Pittman going into Week 17, but if he is out again with concussion symptoms, then Josh Downs could be a sneaky play here in the fantasy playoffs. Rookie running back Tyjae Spears of the Tennessee Titans has been over 4 yards per carry and has had at least 6 targets in 3 of his last 4 games. Now, his 61 targets on the season is 11th best in the NFL, even though he is consistently averaging 50% snap rate. Keep in mind, Derrick Henry is scheduled for free agency this offseason, and if Tyjae Spears inherits a larger role, you could see a pretty significant second-year bump akin to what we saw with Rachaad White in Tampa Bay. Now, speaking of Derrick Henry, a lot has been made of his declining performance this season, right? His snap rate is down, his opportunities per game are down, his yards per carry are at career lows. However, Derrick Henry has finished inside the weekly top 14 in 10 games this season, and he has done it in 3 of his last 4 games. On top of that, Derrick Henry is still running back 10 in PPR scoring on the season. So how is he doing that even with the declining numbers? Well, he has another season of double-digit touchdowns. He is currently at 11 total touchdowns, and he is on pace to match last year's season high in targets and receptions. Seahawks running back Kenneth Walker has been above an 80% opportunity share in back-to-back games with Zach Charbonnet active. Even more surprising is Walker only played 57% of snaps the last 2 weeks. Now, if you look in Week 16, the backfield snaps and opportunity volume for those 2 players, Kenneth Walker only played 34 snaps. He had 17 opportunities. Zach Charbonnet, he played 25 snaps, yet he only had 3 opportunities in Week 16. Lions wide receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown had 14 targets on Sunday, which is the most since Week 7 and only the 3rd game with 10-plus targets in his last 8. Now, his 36% target share on Sunday is the 2nd time since Week 8 that Amon-Ra has broken a minimum 30% target share in a game. He is still solidly around 25% from Weeks 8 to 15, but last week he returned to an elite status. By comparison, rookie tight end Sam Laporta's 3 targets and 8% target share were both season lows, and his 18 receiving yards was also a season low. Now, Laporta is still tight end 3 on the season in PPR scoring. However, he has been outside the top 30 in weekly tight end scoring for 2 of the last 3 weeks. Even with Alexander Mattison active, Vikings running back Ty Chandler still had a 65% snap rate and a 72% backfield opportunity share on Sunday. However, share and volume don't always align. In this case, the 72% share resulted in only 8 carries for Ty Chandler. Now, he finished with 7.7 PPR points, but he was bailed out with a touchdown. Now, I think better days are ahead because Ty Chandler clearly has assumed the running back 1 role away from Alexander Mattison, but the Vikings offense as a whole is going to have to produce better if Ty Chandler is going to have fantasy relevance in Week 17. Commanders quarterback Sam Howell was benched again on Sunday. That is the second consecutive game that has happened. Now, Howell has an abysmal 41% completion percentage over the last 3 weeks. Now, I think Howell is going to have a nice career as a journeyman backup in the league, but he is not the long-term solution for the Washington Commanders. Now, more importantly, from a fantasy standpoint, in 2 games without Brian Robinson, the opportunity share among the Washington backfield looks like this. Chris Rodriguez, last 2 weeks, 48% and 52%. Antonio Gibson, 43% and 47%. Now, Chris Rodriguez also finished as running back 8 on the week with 19.5 PPR points. He was propelled by 2 rushing touchdowns. Now, obviously, the status of Brian Robinson with his hamstring injury is going to be a question to finish out the year. Chris Rodriguez was also spotted wearing a walking boot due to an ankle injury. It could leave Antonio Gibson alone in that backfield, but considering you have San Francisco and Dallas finishing out the year, this is a team as a whole you would just be shying away from. Prior to Week 16, the New York Jets per game averages was 31 combined team targets and 19 combined team rushing attempts. Again, that's per game for the Jets coming in to Week 16. On Sunday, they exploded. They had 45 combined team targets and 36 combined team rushing attempts. That's a delta of 14 additional targets and 17 additional rushing attempts for the team. Now, most notably, Breece Hall had his best game of the season. He had a season-high 77% snap rate, and again, that's important considering the fact that the Jets played considerably more snaps than they have all season. Breece Hall also had his second highest rushing attempts of the season. He had 20 rushing attempts. He had a yard per carry of 4.75, which is his highest since Week 5. He had a season-high 16 targets. That is this first game over 10 targets this season. He also had a season high 12 receptions and 96 receiving yards. It was also his first multi-touchdown game of the season. He had a career best 43.1 PPR points. Now, teammate Garrett Wilson, he had another 15 targets on Sunday, and Garrett Wilson is leading the NFL in total targets. However, his catch rate, which is 58%, is one of the lowest among top target earning wide receivers across the league, and his 3 touchdowns is the lowest among the top 15 wide receivers in total targets. Panthers quarterback Bryce Young finally looked the part of a high quarterback draft pick on Sunday. It was only his 3rd game this season over 63% completion percentage when attempting at least 30 passes. It was his first game over 300 yards passing, and it was his 2nd multi-touchdown game of the season. Now, for reference, Bryce Young had 0 touchdowns combined in his previous 4 games. And according to Fantasy Points data, if you look at Bryce Young's fantasy points per dropback, from weeks 1 through 15, he had an average of 0.27 points per dropback. In week 16, that more than doubled to 0.57, which was slightly above league average. Now, I'll mention too, with this backfield, Miles Sanders continues to see about 30% snap share over their last 5 games. And in the last 2 weeks, Miles Sanders has 5 rushing yards on 9 carries total. Now, this is important because Miles Sanders is guaranteed $6 million in 2024. Teammate Chuba Hubbard is also signed next season for $1.2 million. Now, I think this makes Hubbard a solid dynasty buy right now. He has a late 2nd, early 3rd round price tag. Keep in mind, the Carolina Panthers have a lot of needs, particularly at wide receiver, tight end, and the offensive line. The emphasis will be about how they can improve Bryce Young. They have limited resources when it comes to draft capital as well. So I think this backfield with Hubbard and Sanders is probably locked in for 2024. Now, Chuba Hubbard, he is averaging 15.7 PPR points per game over the last 5, which is 14th best at the running back position in the NFL. Even though Browns wide receiver Amari Cooper was ranked outside the top 20 in ESPN's Week 15 and Week 16 rankings, we highlighted Cooper in both weeks as a recommended start in our Don't Be Afraid to Start Him episode. Now, Cooper finished as wide receiver 14 in Week 15, and then on Sunday in Week 16 he exploded. He finished as the wide receiver 1 on the week with 51.5 PPR points. He caught 11 of 15 targets for 265 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now, Amari Cooper has 37 targets over his last 3, and he is averaging 150 receiving yards per game. And if you look at all wide receivers in the league with a minimum of 500 snaps played, Amari Cooper has a 17.4 yards per reception, which is 3rd best in the NFL. And his yard per reception has drastically climbed this year. Again, 17.4 this year, it was 14.8 last year, and it was 12.7 the previous year. Another correlating stat, his ADOT, his average depth of target this year is 14.1. Last year it was 12.3. The previous year it was 10.6. Now obviously that corresponds to his catch rate. This season it is a season low 56%. Last year was 59%, the previous year was 66%, and dating all the way back to 2020, it was 71%. So while Amari Cooper has become less efficient with his targets, again, his catch rate is coming down. The good news is that the Browns' high passing volume over the last month and a half is helping to offset this because he's getting more volume. In addition, his increased ADOT is providing higher value targets because you're getting more receiving yards with each reception. Jaguars running back Travis Etienne had his lowest number of opportunities on the season on Sunday. He had 6 carries plus 3 targets, 9 total opportunities. Now check out these splits separating Jacksonville's Week 9 bye. Travis Etienne's average snap rate per game. Pre-bye, it was 81%. Post-bye, it was 67%. If you look at Etienne's opportunity volume per game, pre-bye, it was 23.2. Post-bye, it was 16.2. And if you look at his weekly top 15 finishes, pre-bye, he finished in the weekly top 15 in 6 of 8 games. Post-bye, he only finished in the top 15 in 2 out of 7 games. Now, Etienne was a player I highlighted in the preseason as a player I would be shying away from given his average draft position. Now, through the first 9 weeks of the season, that looked like a massive L for me as he was outperforming even his ADP. However, his performance since their bye week is more in line with why I was shying away from him. His snap rate is down, his opportunities are down, and his lack of touchdowns compared to the first 8 weeks of the season have evaporated too. Buccaneers wide receiver Chris Godwin has seen 34 targets in his last 3 games. However, it hasn't yielded much fantasy fruit. You see, 2 of those 3 games, Godwin had a 50% catch rate, and he had no touchdowns in that 3-game sample on 34 targets. In fact, Godwin has played all 15 games this year, but he has finished outside the weekly top 25 at his position in 12 of those 15 weeks. Now, Chris Godwin is plagued by career lows in receptions, catch rate, and touchdown. If you look at his catch rate from 2019 to 2022, a 4-year sample, he was at 74%. He was above 70% in all 4 of those seasons. This year, his catch rate, a career low 62%. His average receptions per game dating back to his breakout 2019, he was at 6.1, 5.4, 7.0, 6.9. This year down to 4.9, so he's down 2 receptions a game compared to the previous 2 seasons when Tom Brady was at quarterback. And most importantly, his total touchdowns by season, he had 9 touchdowns in his breakout 2019 campaign. Since then, he's gone, again, starting from 9, 7, 5, 3, and this year, just 1 touchdown. Bears quarterback Justin Fields had 9 rushing attempts for 97 yards and a touchdown on Sunday. He finished with 25.5 fantasy football points in total. He finished as quarterback 4 on the week. Now, since his Week 11 return, Fields is averaging 11.5 rushing attempts per game. Now, in total, Fields is averaging just over 18 points per game, but a little over half of that, about 9.5 points, comes just from his rushing stats alone. As for the Miami Dolphins, no running back had more than a 50% opportunity share on Sunday. That is only the second time this season that has happened. Now, the running back opportunity share on Sunday, Raheem Mostert had the most at 43%. Devon Achane was at 35%, and Jeff Wilson was at 21%. Yet Mostert still finished with 12 PPR points on just 12 total opportunities, which was good for running back 22 on the week. Cowboys tight end Jake Ferguson has had exactly 8 targets in 4 consecutive games. He has been above a 20% target share in all 4 of those contests. Now, looking back, Dalton Schultz, he finished as tight end 11, tight end 3, and tight end 12 from 2020 to 2022 when he was with the Dallas Cowboys. Jake Ferguson is currently tight end 9 in PPR points on the season. Patriots running back Ezekiel Elliott, he had a season high 9 receptions on 11 targets on Sunday. He had 60 total yards on 23 total opportunities. Now, it wasn't pretty or efficient, but his high target volume plus a touchdown netted him 21 PPR points, which was good for running back 6 on the week. And since Ramondre Stevenson left the Week 13 game early with an injury, Zeke Elliott's weekly finishes in PPR scoring look like this: running back 15, running back 1, running back 27, and running back 6. In the last 2 games without Josh Jacobs, backup running back Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders is averaging the following per game: a 73% snap rate, 20.5 total opportunities, 115 total yards, 5.5 yards per carry, and he has 16 PPR points per game, which is 10th best at the position over the last 2 weeks across the league. Over the last 5 weeks, Travis Kelce has not done any of the following. He hasn't caught a touchdown, he hasn't had a game with at least 8 receptions, and he hasn't had a game where he broke 100 yards receiving. Since Week 12, Travis Kelce is only averaging 11.7 PPR points per game. By comparison, last year, he averaged 18.6, a decline of almost 7 full points per game. In addition, running back Isaiah Pacheco, he returned in Week 16, but he only played 57% of snaps as he had to leave again with a concussion. Now, with Jerick McKinnon on IR, if Pacheco is out in Week 17, then Clyde Edwards-Helaire becomes a priority waiver claim for Week 17. Now, in his single game this year, where CEH broke a 50% snap rate, he scored over 20 PPR points. After concerning usage in Week 15, Giants running back Saquon Barkley was back to his workhorse role on Monday. He had 89% snap rate, he had 100% backfield rush share, and he had a 99% backfield opportunity share. Now, Barkley's 29 opportunities was the most that he's had in a game since Week 8. And when Barkley plays at least 80% of snaps, which has only happened 7 times this season, he averages over 20 PPR points per game. Eagles tight end Dallas Goedert has had 9 targets in each of his last 2 games, which is a target share of 30% and 25% in those 2 contests. Now, Goedert has been second on the team in targets in both contests, ahead of Devontae Smith, who has had a target share of 17% and 14%, respectively. Even without Keaton Mitchell, Ravens running back Gus Edwards continues to play less than 50% of snaps. Yet he has finished inside the weekly top 20 in back-to-back games. Edwards is up to 12 touchdowns on the season, which accounts for 42% of his PPR points. Gus Edwards and Raheem Mostert are the only running backs in the league with more than 40% of their fantasy production coming from touchdowns. Now, teammate Zay Flowers, he had a season-high 13 targets on Monday Night Football. Now, excluding Flowers' 2-target game in Week 15, if you look at Flowers' average per game numbers from Weeks 12, 14, and 16, he has had over 10 targets per game. He's finished with 21.8 PPR points, and he has finished between wide receiver 6 and wide receiver 13 in weekly scoring. And then lastly, the San Francisco 49ers. Coming into Week 16, they averaged per game 25 rush attempts and 25 team targets per game. However, due to them falling into an uncommon negative game script, they only had 18 rushing attempts to 44 total team targets. This is why Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, and Christian McCaffrey were all above 10 targets in Week 16. Now, the 49ers haven't had a single player with at least 10 targets in a game since Week 10. They had 3 players do it on Monday night. So that'll wrap up episode 53 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. We'll be back with another episode on Thursday with recommended players that you should not be afraid to start as we finalize the fantasy season here in Week 17. So for Dustin Chandry signing off, thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.